Well, I'm Dr. Lemmon, and this talk is about a little theory that I've kind of been putting together for years and years and years. I don't really, I've done application for it. The way I operate in life is I get ideas or theories or something, and then I had a group of people, and then we would play it all out and see what kind of results we got from it. They were ideas that other people came up with, or I came up with, one or the other. It's really kind of hard to say when you read a lot of books. After a while, it's kind of hard to distinguish how much of your idea is influenced by something else that you read and don't quite recall. So, so it's not a theory I'm trying to put forth as like, this is the solution to life. It's just a theory, right? I just remember from my talks, I'm looking at what influences us and what we can influence in the world. I think that's the answer to be able to get along with people in the world, to be able to resolve issues in the world, is what kind of an influence do you have? What kind of influence do they have? Where do you sit, right? And then where can you negotiate from there? That's it. It's kind of simple, right? So my basic theory that I noticed way back when I first started out as a kid, kids running around in the woods, lived in Pennsylvania, and we had a lot of open area, and we had very little restrictions on where we were going. I mean, I had a lot of rules. I kind of ignored them. I went where I did. I did whatever I wanted to when I was a little kid. And I just had to kind of defend myself and lie my way out of them. So what I started noticing is that we would see some type of phenomena. So phenomena, don't get caught up in some crazy stuff. Phenomena is like a shooting star, all right, or lights in the woods, or noises that are strange. Never was allowed to go anywhere near the dump, but we used to go to the dump all the time. We never went into it because of the rats. That was pretty obvious. But nonetheless, we would see the city dump, and at nights there'd be glows in it. There'd be things moving in it every now and then. I don't know if there were critters in there or what was going on. I have no idea, right? What all us kids learned really quick is that you don't talk to adults about things you see, because they put you down and they discount it and they tell you a story. Now, it doesn't mean that the story was wrong. It's just that they're operating for more information, right? So we would just play with us. What I did notice when I was a kid is that when we would have a phenomenon, my cousins or friends, I spent my summers at a church camp, which my grandmother had a facility, a house there, a little cabin with no electricity. And so that's where we spent summers. And so there was a lot of kids there, and we would just be playing in the woods, and the people were busy going to church and we were out playing. I noticed that when we would see a phenomena, we'd talk about it, it was hard to remember it. The kids were having a hard time. I'd say, do you remember when this happened? And they look at me and go, oh, kind of, yeah. They would remember a path in the woods. They would remember some type of thing we're learning in school or in church Sunday school or some silliness like that, but they wouldn't remember phenomena. So I started wondering what was special. When I was 6 years old, I wrote my little tablet that kids have with those little lines to write your letters. I wrote, everything is aglow, everything is united. I used the word united. My name was Ted. So at the time I put UNITED, united. So anytime I saw some phenomena, I used that as an anchor. Now, of course, I had no idea what I was doing, but it felt like I could remember things better. So I would look at that and go, united, united, united. And so that little mantra would help for me to anchor that in. And then when I would talk to people, I would remind them of things. And it's like, wow, and then they'd start to remember. My ability to, that little piece of cognition, that little path I was able to carve, was able to put up. Now, that seemed really strange, but I played with that all my life. And so growing up, I would, as I got older, somewhere still in my teens, would see phenomena. Things would be crazy and people couldn't figure them out. And I would just be able to go in and observe them. And it wasn't so much at the effect of them. I could assess and get more details out of them. So it gave me a a little more sense of certainty and confidence, right? So let's put it into this context. I think when I started looking at this, it was not just the question of those strange phenomena. They may have not been real phenomena, but they were to us kids because we didn't have answers. So those elements of those phenomena would drift in and out because they didn't fit with our skill sets, our learned knowledge at the time, our logical structure, right? Let me give you an example from physics, and when we start to look at quantum reality, right? None of this I had when I was, of course, a kid. It was just whatever it was. But nonetheless, today, or at least in 2020, this concept of the parallax is something that I blogged about in 2020. For a whole year, I kind of obsessed about it and talked about it from every angle, because I was trying to figure out how we can utilize this theory to make some applications, right, moving forward. So when we look at the quantum world in 2020, pretty much the drift of it is that our universe is made up of 4 different energies. They're really, really close to each other mathematically. So it might be different states of one energy, but there's basically, from our ability to measure things, it looks like there's 4 different types of energy everywhere in our universe, plus dark energy, which we don't know anything about because it's dark, we can't see it, but it has an influence. So we know it's there. We see the influence of it, we can't see it. You have to remember, starting out, our universe, our logical world, has a range. It's not infinity, it's a range. It's called Planck's constant. There's anything smaller than Planck's constant or anything larger than Planck's constant, we can't see, we can't process, we can't have it. It doesn't fit in our logical piece. So we just have a range, that's it. So we start out with a range. That's what we got, a range, okay? So it's a big range, but it's most certainly a range. And so sitting in that range, it means that in the universe, there's energy out there that's moving around. Like I said, we've labeled them as 4 different types. This energy that's moving around in kind of a chaotic system, appears to be some type of chaotic system, it collides. And those pieces that collide kind of jam together, producing influences on one another, right? And they produce a potential for a particle, right? So that potential for a particle can take expression in 4 different variations. So we have 4 potential ideas of what a particle might be. And those particles have some variation in 3 different steps, have to do with density. So the ultimate potential, from what we know now, or at least in 2020, was that energy slams together. It produces potentials for particles. Those particles could fit into any one of 12 particles, right? It's 4 across the top with some variation with density going down. And then there's another particle, which is called Higgs particle. And that's kind of like when you run your hand through the sand, you make a pile of sand in front of it. So a Higgs particle is one of those 12 particles is going through this energy. It pushes some of that energy and produces another particle that we know very little about, because we came up with the idea, I wasn't really part of it, but we humans came up with the idea in the 60s mathematically, and it was just a few years ago we were able to actually produce one for a short few seconds or parts of a second. So we know that there's another particle potentially possible, right? Besides the 12 that we have labeled. They're potential particles, and the reason they're potential is that they don't have form unless there's a conscious observer. What does that mean? That means that you and I are looking at it. We'd have to look at it for a device because they're pretty small, so magnifying, or a device is reading it and then giving us a report. When that occurs, these things no longer act like a wave of energy. They start acting like a particle. Now, we still have dark matter, which is particles that we still don't know anything about, right? And it makes up a huge chunk of our universe. So, it seems like we've learned a lot, but there's a lot of phenomena going on. You see what I'm saying? That's phenomena. It doesn't fit. We could take these potential particles, these 4 particles that have variations producing 12. And when you work the math on that, there's not a whole lot of variation with them. So it could really just be one energy in one particle in different states influencing each other. Possible. We just don't know. Now, all of a sudden, we've got an influence we can work with. The influence we get to work with is that we can observe it. And when we observe it, we influence it. And we change a wave, something that functions like a wave, into something that functions like a particle. Wow. So what I would call the nature of creation, right? Our attention or our relationship with it changes it ultimately from a world of energy to a world of form, right? It didn't happen once upon a time. It just happens every time you observe. Your attention is very, very powerful. I'm not saying that you're powerful. I'm just saying your attention is very powerful. Okay, you got this, right? So then once we attend to this, we have these particles. We can then take these particles and assemble them in different relationships. They have different charges, and we can put together, we have 200 more or less elements in our atomic table, right? That don't all necessarily exist. Some of them we haven't even seen, but they're all worked out to a logical system. So these should be probable. And so then everything in our logical world is made out of those elements, which are then manufactured from those particles, which are actually waves of energy until we attend to them. Now, that's my view of the transition from the world of phenomena, stuff that we just can't explain, doesn't mean that our stories are true, right? Just like in a logical world, our stories aren't always true. There are writers, there are scientists, there are people that make up stories about stuff and have good grounded information, and then they discover more information. The story's now wrong, right? Stories is useful. It helps us communicate and relate. And then we can start to notice differences and we can bridge those gaps and we can learn. Stories are a very powerful tool. But when you get into the phenomenal world, we have to use language, which comes from the logical world. We have to use thinking, which comes from the logical world. We have to use all this type of stuff. So when we get to phenomena, we either label it as something or we discount it completely and say it's crazy, right? Just like people that are looking for space aliens or looking for dead uncles or whatever. I'm not saying any of that stuff meets our logical system. Obviously, it doesn't meet our logical system, so it's not part of it. So it's when from our logical system, it's all BS. But it is a phenomena that more than one people have shared in. It's something that's really very human. So it means something. It's a real phenomena. It just doesn't fit in our logical system. There's 2 systems at play. There's a phenomena system that's most certainly a chaotic system, but things happen in it. And we don't know how it happens, and we don't know why it happens, and we only can see a little range of it, not the whole thing. So we're just peeking through a crevice in a wall or a fence, looking at what's on the other side, trying to make up something. That's where we sit, right? So that phenomena is pretty big. Maybe someday we'll figure it out. But when we look at uncertainty that comes from quantum mechanics, it means that we'll never have our level of certainty. Remember, I said memory was kind of a strange thing with phenomena. It's almost like if you're walking in the woods, you look at 2 paths and you think for a second, you go, okay, I remember that's the path we took last time. You can come to a level of certainty in your logical thinking by remembering trees, designs, paths, patterns. Patterns is what we run off of, right? But when it comes to phenomena, we lose that certainty. We don't have that. As a matter of fact, all the options that come to mind are kind of equally. So it's really kind of different. Fortunate that I built that anchor in when I was a kid, because it allowed me to examine that and notice other people didn't have that same level of certainty with phenomena, right? Just a little game, right? All this is figuring out how to play with this, what to do with it, right? Okay, so we have this one system over here at play, which is a phenomena system. It's just stuff that just happens in the world of energy. It's a world of all of energy and things happen. We don't, none of it makes any logical sense to us. We observe some of it. I have no idea why we can even observe it, but when we observe it, we have a hard time translating it. We have a hard time putting it in our mind. We have a hard time labeling it because it doesn't fit any of the protocols that we have or experience we have. It sounds vague. And when you hear a physicist talk about this, it's kind of like, really? I mean, this sounds kind of silly, right? It does sound silly. It is, uncertainty is silly. The uncertainty just is that we don't know where something is, but we have a probability of where it might be. Like, that's pretty much defining uncertainty as it sits. So there are some elements that come up to play. I'm looking for my sheet here. Hold on. Which I got to get on my website. It's not on there right now. But the phenomena system seems to have some properties within it, as far as I can define. That's using logical terms, just like when the physicists are talking about quantum theory, they're using logical terminology to explain the phenomena, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this may not make a whole lot of sense. But what I found in this chaotic system of phenomena is that it seems to purport a sense of balance, that to have potential to do all things means that if you did any one of all things, you would now be out of balance. So therefore, the potential to do all things exists with no demonstration. So therefore, it's all just phenomena. It's the potential for, just like that particle is the potential for. It's a piece of energy has the potential for. So it would have to be into a balance, right? That's why Heidegger, the philosopher, says, why do we have something instead of nothing? We should have nothing out of all potential, because once you have something, we're now out of balance. The whole thing would then no longer be one, would not be a demonstration of all potential, would be a biased piece. So we struggle in the logical world getting rid of those biases, whether you call that prejudice or racism or whatever you call those biases. It seems to be the nature of us thinking in a smaller dimension rather than in a phenomena dimension. So phenomena would have a sense of balance. It most certainly would have all range possible. But remember, our logical world has a smaller range, so it would have an unlimited range. It could see all those things. But we have a smaller range and we can't even begin to entertain our range. In other words, because our consciousness is reduced, designed that way, I think, just because of the fact it keeps us from getting lost totally in the woods all the time. And it would therefore, in this phenomena system, have played on all things. To have a balance, everything would have to relate. One movement somewhere would affect everything because it would be all connected. So the idea of balance, range, and relationship would be inherently in phenomena. Now, the reason why this is important is right now we're in an evolutionary change or a pandemic, whatever you want to call that. But pretty much historically, when we get into these type of crises, it's usually an evolutionary change. And that's another whole conversation. But nonetheless, in an evolutionary change, what we have to do to move through, that means our logical system's kind of shuffling. And so our logical system, that little range that we sit in, is getting all shuffled around. It's getting shuffled around and becoming more complex, not actually by multiplication, but by division. So if a foot was 12 inches, now we're looking at a foot as 24 inches. It's still the same size, but we've divided into more pieces. So now we have pieces that work well together, and we have pieces now we can exclude, we could remove because we don't need them anymore. So that's kind of the nature of what evolution does, right? So our logical system goes through changes. When it goes through changes, we find that if we can go back and anchor, remember, I started with an anchor, UNITED, UNITED, right? So that was an anchor. We can get back and anchor into balance, range, and relationship. We then can allow our whole system to churn and change, and it allows us something to play into, right? Not really new ideas, right? But it used to be that the old idea was that we'd anchor into the idea of God and religion became the anchor, but that didn't really work out all that great, right? Because of the fact that we personalized God and immediately made God something that fit into the logical world. And so we lost all that sense of balance and range and relationship, right? And we just became, every little group had their own God. It just was kind of meaningless, right? And that really required there be an absolute. And then if you have an absolute, you have a bias. And if you have a bias, you don't have balance. So none of that played out. And that's what we see in the history, right? We've gone through evolutionary changes before. Do we survive it? No, we do not survive them. They last 300, 400, 500 years. We do not survive them because we don't live that long. If you find someone that's lived 4 or 5 years, they could talk about it. I've lived on this planet 77 years now, and I came in the cusp of where the last evolutionary change had reached majority and was now the primary game on the planet. And now I'm looking where we're starting into another evolutionary change that will probably take 200 or 300 more years to come to fruition if we manage to not endanger ourselves too much. But it's interesting. We seem to raise above, right? We came out of the jungle. We did, whatever story they put on all this. Who knows how much of that is true? As it progresses, it seems like we hit these evolutionary changes. We're thrown more pieces, right? As we throw more pieces, we sort them all out and we build a new game. That's it. I call it a game, right? Because anytime you play Monopoly and doesn't matter who wins, everything gets thrown in a box and it's put in a cupboard. It's all over, right? There's no advantage to winning or losing. So we're playing a game that everybody dies in. There's nothing to win, there's nothing to lose. But a multimillionaire is just going to die. A homeless person is just going to eventually die. And what was the end result was what? So you have to start to look, and you have to look at this as kind of a game. And it's like what we get to do with this game is that we get to play with the pieces. We get to sort things out. We get to relate. We get to build momentum. We get to be able to put a focus and influence in a direction. And we're staging this to have the game be continued. Maybe for you, it goes in a box and in a cupboard, it's all over. But for the next group, going down the game. So the game is something that plays out. Do we have some type of form or something? Oh, not in a logical world, that's for sure. I have no idea what in the phenomenal world that occurs. But personally, I don't really feel that soul personalities exist because they would have to be a bias. So I think if we go back into the world of energy, that would look something that doesn't really fit into our logical world very well, right? So two systems of play. In the logical system, we have, of course, number one is attention, right? We attend to those things and we start producing particles out of pieces of energy, right? The next thing we have is we can ask questions. We then combine those pieces of energy, those particles. We can put this whole thing into a matrix or patterns. So we ask good questions. We find ways that work. And we make decisions. We literally look at that stuff and decide what's going on, right? We can play because there's so many of us, right? You took all potential and divided it by 8 billion different threads playing out. Then you start to see those 8 billion would then have their own little range. All those little ranges would make up the range. All those little potentials would make up all potentials. Therefore, we would have this little demonstration that we could produce and an influence that we could produce. And we could play out all those to test them like you would in a lab, to test things to see which work best. We could play these out and leave a legacy going forward of how to play the game better, what comes into it. Who knows if you come back or you don't come back or what? Who cares, right? I'm not all that sure at this point. I look back over the game of life and I think, wow, a lot of ups and downs, a lot of ups and downs, right? So there's some good notes and some sad notes. And wow, if I had to restructure it, I'm not sure what I would do, right? Would I want to be in this forever? I don't think so. Anyway, those are two systems that come together. So it's not necessarily a dualistic. There's ideas like this have been out for a long time. I'm just saying, I'm calling out a parallax. We have two systems that interface with people, with each other. You can see the two systems at play. One makes totally logical sense. The other one doesn't make logical sense, but most certainly they're interactive. And that's because I think phenomena system put our logical range together as a little bit of a test or a playground. Hey, it's just a game in a box. That's it, right? So we're a game in a box, right? And when you put it all out, wow, there it is. It's like a mystical world. We play the game over here on a board, and the rest of the world is over here, which is some other type of phenomenon. And so that's the way I look at it. I look there for influences that are coming into play. And so in an evolutionary change, in this particular evolutionary change, I came to the conclusion that we start to look into what the 2021 blogs were about, is that we really need to go back and secure into range. Because what's happening right now is that we've secured in the past into relationships, became a tribal marker, and we did that for a long time. I think relationships are something that we've got more of a handle on than range, because our range is, number one, small, and then number two, our conscious piece is really tiny. So we then don't just have a range or a bigger range, we have to have an assortment of ranges. So now all of a sudden, if I give you an assortment of 2,000 different things that work, we just made a jigsaw puzzle really complicated. We put in 5,000 ranges, we put in 10, it gets really complicated. So what we have to do at this point, I think, is that we have to take a look at the ranges. We have to build some new ones, start to build better structure and ranges so we can access and utilize them a little better. We have to use the knowledge we got from our logical system to be able to take those new pieces and start to sort them out into new ranges so that we can start to move forward. So that's my story of the parallax. And so anyway, Dr. Chris Lemmon, if you have any questions, why go ahead and email me at Wizards Catch. So it's Chris at Wizards Catch. Email me, or you can look at the blogs on wizardscatch.com. And so thank you very much. It's been fun chatting. I hope I didn't run this thing too long. All right. Thanks again.